Hello and welcome to the Kick Sugar Summit, the world's first summit on the topic of sugar, sugar addiction, and sugar addiction recovery. We know that if we're going to reverse our rising rates of chronic disease, we need to reduce or eliminate our consumption of sugar and refined carbohydrates. We are here to help you do that. There are a lot of speakers on our summit and a lot of information. Don't get overwhelmed. Catch who you can and just let the rest go. Alternatively, you could purchase one of our Summit VIP packages, which comes with an awesome ebook summarizing the core insights of each speaker, a year's worth of resources from our world of experts, and access to a whole year of weekly drop-in live Q&As with me, Florence, your host. Thank you for being here. I hope you love the summit, and I hope it changes your life.
Welcome, everyone, to the 9th Annual Kick Sugar Summit. My name is Molly Painshab, and I'm your host today, along with guest Dr. David Katz. So Dr. Katz is a specialist in internal medicine, preventative medicine, public health, and lifestyle medicine with expertise in nutrition. The recipient of numerous awards for teaching, writing, and contributions to public health, Dr. Katz was a 2019 James Beard Foundation Award nominee in health journalism, has been a widely supported nominee for the position of U.S. Surgeon General, and has received 3 honorary doctorates. He is a 2023 recipient of a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Doctors World Gala. He holds multiple U.S. patents, has over 200 peer-reviewed publications, has published many hundreds of online and newspaper columns, has authored or co-authored 19 books to date, including multiple editions of leading textbooks in nutrition, preventative medicine, and epidemiology. His most recent book for a general audience, How to Eat, co-authored by Mark Bittman, was a 2021 IACP Awards finalist. His career-long focus has been the translation of science into action for the addition of years to life and life to years, and on the confluence of human and planetary health. Welcome, Dr. Katz.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's great to be with you. And widely supported versus wildly supported. I was wildly supported too, but that was just my mother, so I don't think that counts.
Perfect. Yes. Awesome. Well, let's just get right into it. Can you fill us in, talk to us about what has been your personal and professional journey that has really gotten you to where you are today with these many publications, with all this philanthropic, if I could speak this morning, work that you've done? How did you get here? Give us the origin story, if you will.
Sure, will do. Hey, Barney, get out of here if you're going to bark, will you? So it starts very personal, inevitably, and it started young for me. My dad's a cardiologist. I was always inspired by him. You know, as a kid, I didn't know what he was talking about, but I knew he was talking about really important things. He'd be on call every other night. I'd hear him on the phone, and words I didn't understand, but I sensed the drama. I could tell life and death was on the line. I admired somebody who was able to step in and deal with crises like that. So I found medicine and the idea of being that person someone else can turn to in their hour of greatest need very compelling. And that influenced me for sure. And then I got into sports in my tweens and teens, started taking it more and more seriously. And then as I started taking better care of my body with athletics, I started thinking a high performance body needs high performance fuel. I really need to pay a little more attention about what I'm putting in the tank. I mean, if that's true for any other machine, it's got to be true for this machine. So I started getting really focused on that. And then I had some early ethical epiphanies. I love dogs. We always had a dog. I've got 3 now who are apt to make noise during this. I always loved horses. I love to ride. I have 2 horses now. And, it just wasn't okay for me that some of these guys were members of the family and other animals just like them were dinner. So I made some decisions based on personal ethics and started down the road toward being, quite serious about how I approach nutrition. And then, the rest is history up to a point. College, med school, residency. Wasn't quite sure what I wanted to be when I grew up, so I did internal medicine. And then I had my next big epiphany, and that was I was learning how to be all the king's horses and all the king's men. In other words, I was in med school in the 1980s. Beds were filled with a lot of patients who had AIDS, which was horrible back then. Now it's a manageable disease, but back then it was just devastating. But we also had the run-of-the-mill calamities of modern epidemiology. We had heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, dementia, emphysema. And I couldn't help but notice, I'm a big picture person, I couldn't help but notice that easily 8 out of 10 hospital beds were filled by people in a desperate state who never needed to get that sick. In other words, it wasn't for, it wasn't just bad karma. It wasn't that we didn't know what to do. If we had done other things right 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years, if they had done different things over the course of their lifetime, they wouldn't have had the stroke, the heart attack, the cancer, the diabetes, and so on. And I thought, it's just not good enough to show up after the fact and keep trying to patch Humpty Dumpty back together again. Somebody's got to do something about the damn wall. We need a lower wall. We need a seatbelt on the wall. We need cushions at the base of the wall. We need all the, we've got to do that. How can I be that guy? So I did a second residency in preventive medicine, public health. And I combined my interest in nutrition, which was longstanding and again, began somewhat personally, with what I had learned about the human body and realized, wow, food is unbelievably important. All this, it's the fuel that runs every aspect of this machine, and it's the construction material too. It's almost impossible to overstate the importance of nutrition to human health. So then I sought to combine the two. So when I did my preventive medicine residency at Yale and got my master's in public health, I focused on the role of nutrition in chronic disease epidemiology. And then the rest is history, because then I knew what I wanted to be when I grew up. And just one last thing to round out this answer, and that is, very early in my career, I was influenced by my residency director in preventive medicine, Jim Jekyll, long since retired. And I forget the context and exactly what we were talking about, but Jim quoted Gertrude Stein to me: "A difference to be a difference must make a difference." It's stuck with me ever since. And, always appreciate when somebody bothers to read my bio or portions of it. And, it sounds terrific. And no doubt young people look at that and think, wow, I hope to accomplish all of that or some of that. But is it really accomplishment if it hasn't made things better in the world? Now, my hope is it has. My hope is I've made my contributions. But here's the harsh reality. When I started out wanting to add years to life to years, when I wanted to help reverse trends in obesity, diabetes, other chronic diseases, and over the last decade and a half, where I wanted to play a significant role in helping to stabilize the health of this glorious planet, I'd take stock of where we are. And the harsh reality is, across all of those metrics, worse, 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 worse. We're not winning the war. We have more obesity than when I started, more chronic disease than when I started. It's affecting people at younger age than when I started. It affects more countries around the world than when I started. And the planet is horrendously imperiled. So, it's nice to think about accomplishments, but from my point of view, I've got promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, because the things that I wanted to change in the world have mostly changed in the wrong direction. And so I always appreciate an opportunity like this to get together with an audience of people and hope that by sharing these reflections, we motivate one another, we give one another reality check. Nobody should think, people who've gone before me have done so much, there's nothing left for me to do. I mean, wow, we all have miles to go before we sleep.
Beautifully said. So in this worsening epidemic that you've seen over the course of your career, I imagine, because we're on the Kick Sugar Summit, I'm going to bring sugar into this. Right. So I imagine added sugar in what we're consuming has something to do with it. So what might be the harms of added sugar in our diet today? And is that the whole story?
Great segue. And I couldn't agree more. The one thing I'll say right at the start is there isn't just one thing wrong with the typical American diet. Pretty much everything's wrong with it. And one of the things I tend to object to is people latch on to a scapegoat and then forget about everything else. And all we've managed to accomplish with that approach is inventing innumerable ways to eat badly. We fix it on one thing, fix that, or think we're fixing it, and break everything else. But absolutely, sugar is a major liability. It's a major liability for two distinct reasons. One related to appetite, marketing, the military-industrial complex, and all of that. And then the other related to the downstream metabolic effects. let's start with downstream metabolic effects. In some ways, that's less interesting, and it's a part of the story I think everybody knows. Sugar is rapidly metabolizable fuel in the body. In order to metabolize sugar, we need to release insulin. Insulin is pro-inflammatory. When you have a lot of sugar in the bloodstream, you need more insulin. The more insulin you have, the more inflammation you have, the more likely you are to divert those calories in the sugar to a storage depot, namely fat. Insulin is really good at converting surplus simple carbohydrate sugar into fat stores. And under the influence of high levels of insulin, there's a particular tendency for those fat stores to occur in the worst possible places. So not just in what we call subcutaneous fat, but fat under the skin, but actually in vital organs. And this can happen in many vital organs, but the one we talk about most is the liver. So high levels of sugar in the diet all the time, resulting in high levels of sugar in the bloodstream all the time, result in high levels of insulin all the time, which is pro-inflammatory, triggers a whole cascade of other hormones, and essentially throws everything out of balance and favors the deposition of fat in really dangerous places, in particular the liver. And it's dangerous for many reasons, but among them is it actually tends to destabilize the entire insulin glucose system. So in other words, as fat starts to infiltrate the liver, you become more and more prone to insulin resistance. Now you need even more insulin to get that sugar into cells. And so the inflammatory effects of the insulin worsen. The deposition of fat in bad places increases, and the ability to regulate blood sugar deteriorates. And this trend is propagated countless times every day in America, because America runs on Dunkin' and a whole host of other very questionable choices. So the metabolic effects relate to the fact that it's rapidly metabolizable fuel. It's readily converted into body fat. It triggers an insulin release. It's pro-inflammatory. It destabilizes multiple other competing hormones, including the fight and flight hormones. And there's a lot of physiology we could unpack. But bottom line is constant high exposure to sugar results in increasing risk of insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, and then ultimately, when your body just can't keep up and the pancreas poops out making so much insulin, type 2 diabetes. And then type 2 diabetes is a gateway condition to vascular disease, including heart attack, strokes, amputation, blindness, kidney failure, and so forth. And my sympathies to anybody listening who has family members dealing with that, or if any of you are dealing with that, because it's so common. And it's so unnecessary. And before I pivot to the other part of the story, which is actually the more interesting, Molly, just to quickly note, when I was a medical student and resident, they taught us about two kinds of diabetes mellitus. They taught us about juvenile onset, which is an autoimmune disease, still not completely understood, and requires insulin be administered to the body, and adult onset. And I mention that because we don't use those terms anymore, because what used to be adult onset diabetes is type 2. And the reason it's type 2 is it's not limited to adults. It would be very awkward to be talking about adult onset diabetes in 8, 9, 10, 11-year-olds. But from my point of view, that's exactly what we ought to be doing, because it would remind us it's just in the span of a generation or two that we took a condition that never happened to kids and we converted it with our apathy, with our society awash in all this superfluous sugar. We converted it into a pediatric scourge, totally unnecessary. But kids now routinely get what used to be adult onset diabetes, and it's largely driven by surplus sugar, surplus calories, surplus insulin, and downstream mayhem. The other part of the story, the marketing, military industrial complex, Madison Avenue part of the story, I actually think that's the more interesting, and in some ways the more pernicious. And this has been described really well many times in the popular press, but I routinely cite the work of Michael Moss. And anybody coming to the Kick Sugar Summit needs to know Michael Moss. His two books, Salt, Sugar, Fat, and Hooked, are all about the machinations of big food and the marketing of big food. For those who don't know, Michael's a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist and a great writer. So he extracted from his book, Salt, Sugar, Fat, a New York Times Magazine cover story entitled The Extraordinary Science of Addictive Junk Food. And I say that with a slow cadence because we really have to let that just sift into our brains. The extraordinary science of addictive junk food. In other words, okay, it's junk on purpose. It's addictive on purpose. And nobody just stumbled into it. They actually have scientists doing science to figure out how to make addictive junk where food ought to be. All of that is entirely true. Michael validates it in his writing. So just Google Moss addictive. You'll pull up The Extraordinary Science of Addictive Junk Food. Absolutely read that. But I can tell you that at all the big food companies, they have teams of scientists. They have all the best tech, like functional MRI machines, and marching orders to do experiments in people and sometimes other animals, play around with what you put in the food and figure out how to light up the appetite center in the ventromedial hypothalamus like a Christmas tree. And lots of things can do that, but the thing that does it best is sugar. And so sugar is not just harmful because we eat too much sugar and all the things I just described that sugar does. Sugar is put into food to create willfully addictive junk. That's why it's everywhere. The entire food supply is laced with stealth sugar. So there are places you're getting sugar, it's there. You're drinking something sweet, you're having dessert, that there's sugar there. It's everywhere else too. It's in pasta sauce, it's in salad dressing, it's in salty snacks. There's some of it even over your fast food French fries. It is everywhere, and that's by design. And it's because sugar puts the appetite center into overdrive. And the final thing I'll say on this topic, Molly, is we all know that there's a special love for sugar. We all know there's a special appetite for sugar because think about, celebration, a holiday, big family meal, that time you ate until you were literally thinking and maybe even saying, I could not eat another bite. You lay down your fork in exhaustion, and the next words out of your mouth or the person next to you are, what's for dessert? And then suddenly there's more room. And there's sort of folklore about we always have room for dessert. There's a hollow leg, there's an extra stomach reserved for dessert. There isn't. What there is, though, is a higher threshold for fullness in the sweet category than in any other flavor category, built into the human appetite center, hardwired into our brains. And that is willfully exploited by the food supply every day, and you are the victim of that. You combine those two things, you've got manipulation to make you overeat sugar, and then all the harms of excess sugar, and you wind up exactly where we are. Pandemic obesity getting worse by the year, pandemic type 2 diabetes getting worse around the world.
So in having that knowledge, because obviously, I don't think that that's a secret anymore. Like you were saying, like this, people have read Michael Moss's, all of his, many of his writings. Dr. Robert Lustig has talked a lot about this as well, So how can consumers be more aware of how much added sugar they are consuming? I've heard there's up to like 257 names these days for sugar.
There might be. I couldn't come up with that many. I could come up with a lot, not nearly that many. So that's important. So I'm a nutrition expert, and I can't come up with 257 names for sugar, which might mean there are some I wouldn't specifically recognize. Chances are, there's an ose at the end or some familiar thing that makes it say, that sounds like the other sugars I do know. It's probably a kind of sugar. But important, Molly. So what do? We developed a program at my lab at Yale years ago called Nutrition Detectives. It was a food label literacy program directed to elementary school kids. We studied it. We did randomized trials. We kind of invented the concept of food label literacy. We developed a validated tool to assess it. We proved that when we did this program, it changed the food label literacy of kids and their parents, because the kids, the 8 and 9-year-olds, learned it in school in 90 minutes and took it home to mom and dad, and it changed mom and dad's food label literacy. And we simplified things because we wanted something that could fit on a refrigerator magnet that an 8-year-old could remember. So we said the shorter the ingredient list, the better. If there's anything in an ingredient list you can't recognize, pick something else. Food ought to be recognizable as food. Now, there are, of course, times when food is fortified with vitamins and minerals, and maybe you don't know all those names either. So every rule has exceptions. But in general, the simple answer to how do you avoid 257 varieties of sugar is eat as much stuff direct from nature as you possibly can. It really is overall diet quality that matters. And if you think about what you ought to be eating, and not ought to because I say so, not ought to because I'm a doctor wagging a finger, ought to because healthy people have more fun. Your life is better. You take good care of yourself. You take good care of your body. It takes better care of you. You can do more of what you want, more years in life, more life in years. And that is something you can share with the people you love. That's the ought. That's the should. So, frankly, if your diet's mostly made up of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds, and plain water when thirsty, really mostly that, and that doesn't exclude all the other things, but the emphasis is there and less of the other things. Well, there is no hidden sugar in almonds. There is no hidden sugar in broccoli. There is no hidden sugar in an apricot. Yes, there is sugar in an apricot. All fruit has sugar, and many vegetables have a little bit, but it's naturally occurring sugar that is quite dilute and that comes along with a wide array of beneficial nutrients that actually, in many cases, directly mitigate the effects of sugar on metabolism. So, for example, you eat fruit as a source of fiber and sugar, and this audience may know these things, but the fiber, in particular soluble fiber, will slow the rate of entry of sugar from a fruit, from the GI tract into the bloodstream, and minimize the insulin requirement. It essentially reversing everything I just described as being an adverse effect of sugar. Eating fruit, even though it's a source of sugar, in particular fructose, has consistently been shown to reduce risks of obesity and diabetes. So first strategy clearly is eat more of stuff you know is good and can't be hiding any of the 257 varieties of sugar. And you're safe every time you do that. When you do eat something that's processed or packaged, I do recommend looking at the ingredient list. If it's really long, step away from the box and nobody will get hurt. If it's, moderately long and you're not sure, I would say if they're unrecognizable things and there's an alternative where you know what's in it, I kind of prefer knowing what I'm putting in my body. It's a very intimate relationship we have with food. Again, it's the fuel that runs us every day, and it's the construction material that we use every day. And that's not just kids who are growing, who clearly need construction material. So any parent in the mix here, you are literally growing your children out of the food you give them. So, suddenly junk food takes on a very sinister character when you think this is the construction material for a body that I love, that I want to have the longest, healthiest possible life. We wouldn't build anything we care about out of junk, and yet we routinely in America build our children and our grandchildren out of junk. We need to think about that. But as adults, we're turning over hundreds of millions of cells every day. We're turning over our microbiome. We're turning over enzymes, hormones, all of that, cell membranes, all needs replacement material. Where does that come from? From food. So in a much more literal sense than most people realize, we are what we eat. So that's a reason to avoid junky stuff. And it's mostly in junky stuff with long ingredient lists where all these different kinds of sugar are hiding. And then, again, I would say there's an allowance for some sugar in your diet. Some people want to avoid it completely. I think that's fine. You can avoid all added sugar. It's hard to do, but if you're committed to it, good for you. But on the other hand, my wife, who's a fantastic cook and French and a foodie, shares my views of nutrition, but also says it's all got to be delicious. And by the way, she has a wonderful free recipe site. Your listeners can take advantage of it. Cuisinicity, like cuisine city with an I in the middle, cuisinicity.com. All the Katz family greatest hits, yours for free. Help yourselves. But she and I talk about putting sugar in its place. Those times you want a beautiful dessert, a little bit of sugar there, you get a huge reward at a relatively low cost. And, it's a tiny part of your diet. It's a special occasion kind of thing. And it's delightful, and it's delicious, and you remember it. So, I think that's important too. Is this a place where there ought to be sugar? There shouldn't be sugar as a first ingredient in a breakfast item. Breakfast shouldn't be sugar. And many commercial breakfast cereals, especially kids cereals, the first ingredient is not a cereal. It's not a grain. It's sugar. And then the grains come. Well, then that's not a cereal grain with sugar. That's sugar with, some amount of cereal grain as a sidekick. That's just wrong. There shouldn't be sugar in salad dressing. Who would pour sugar over a salad? There shouldn't be sugar in pasta sauce. Who would sprinkle sugar over their spaghetti? But there is sugar in marinara sauce, added sugar. There is sugar in salad dressing. There is sugar in so many places it doesn't belong. I call that stealth sugar. That's sugar in foods you don't even think of as sweet. So they're really important. Look at the ingredient list of all those different things you buy in bags, boxes, bottles, jars, and cans. And if you see high fructose corn syrup or any of the other 257 varieties of added sugar, see if you can find another one just like it at about the same price. And I bet you can most of the time, that doesn't have added sugar. Pick that instead, because just by eliminating that stealth sugar, and you don't have to know all the 257 names of sugar in the food supply to do this, but by eliminating that, you're eliminating gram after gram after gram after gram of sugar in your daily diet, and you haven't even touched the sweet stuff. Now, there's much more to be done when you get to the sweet stuff without even, if you say, I've got a sweet tooth, it's going to be hard for me to get rid of the sweet stuff. Before you even get to the sweet stuff, you can reduce your intake of sugar by focusing on sugar where it doesn't belong. And one of the advantages of that is, although you won't really object because you didn't expect that food to be sweet in the first place, you'll be dialing down your threshold for recognizing sugar and other things. In other words, the more you soak your taste buds in sweetness all the time, even when you don't know it's there, the more you put them in a sugar-induced coma, so they can't detect sugar anyway. I mean, you need massive amounts to wake them up. When you reverse engineer that process and expose your taste buds to less and less and less sugar, they become more sensitive to it. And your dessert suddenly that you still have is now too sweet. And now you're ready to start reducing sugar in the sweet stuff too, because it's now too sweet.
So thinking about that, can your tongue or your body in general, can it tell the difference between like high fructose corn syrup, which is like a name for sugar, or just like straight table sugar or any of the other varieties of sugar out there?
So yes and no. Can your body tell the difference? I mean, if we're talking about all the different ways the body reacts to different sugars, yes. Because, for example, high fructose corn syrup does not require the action of sucrase. It's an enzyme the body makes that cleaves sucrose, which is, a combination of fructose and glucose, but they're bound together. And you actually need an enzyme to break that into what are called monosaccharides. So it's a disaccharide. It's broken into monosaccharides. There's an enzymatic response, and your body activates that enzyme. It doesn't do that for high fructose corn syrup, which is the same combination, by the way, of glucose and fructose, but they're not bounded together. So you don't activate the enzyme. So sure, you're at some level, your body can tell the difference. But remember the quote that inspired so much of my efforts: a difference to be a difference must make a difference. So your body can tell the difference. Does that make any difference? No. In both cases, whether you activate the sucrase enzyme to cleave glucose and fructose, or you just administer unbonded glucose and fructose in high fructose corn syrup, either way, you wind up with both. And what really matters is the dose. It's the dose that makes the poison. Famous quote by Paracelsus, the father of modern toxicology: the dose makes the poison. You had a very little bit of any particular kind of sugar in your diet, vanishingly small amount, less than 1% of total calories on average, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You'd be doing something else, Molly. I'm sure it would be important work, but it would be other important work, because we wouldn't have this problem. We have this problem because of the dose, massive amounts of sugar. And frankly, high fructose corn syrup contributes to the excess. Sucrose or table sugar contributes to the excess. The other 255 varieties contribute to the excess. So we eat way too much. And it doesn't make much difference which one you're exposed to. And that's really important because, the food industry has engaged in all sorts of shenanigans with this. So when we all learned that high fructose corn syrup was bad, but we didn't really know especially why it was bad, we just knew that's particularly bad. In many instances, manufacturers said, okay, we're gonna give them, go back to the future. We're gonna give them the sucrose we took out, because we took it out because we could put something else in they wouldn't recognize. And then we could maybe slip one by them and there'd be added sugar, but they wouldn't know because they don't know what high fructose corn syrup is. Then we all learned what high fructose corn syrup is. We learned it was bad. And they said, okay, now they're on to us. They know it's bad. Now we can go back where we started and pretend that's a good move because we're getting rid of the high fructose corn syrup. And there were literally packages. There's less of this now because you guys are too savvy now. But and by the way, that's thanks to what you do, Molly, and many other people who are helping to get the word out. So thank you for that. So that the consumers are too savvy to fool on some of these issues. But basically, you'd get packages that would say in bold letters across the front, now without high fructose corn syrup. And they wouldn't say, yeah, we put back in just the exact same amount of sugar, which has exactly all the same metabolic effects. And by the way, it's what we took out to put the high fructose corn syrup in the first place. And maybe we're going to even charge you a little bit more now because we're telling you we got rid of this bad thing. And so to say thank you to us, we'll add a premium. I mean, we've done this over and over and over again for years. So no, in ways that matter, it doesn't make a difference to the body. And in terms of our tongues, you asked about, can we tell the difference at the level of taste between sucrose and high fructose corn syrup? Not at all. Between pure glucose, which we never get other than in a medical setting, a glucose tolerance test, and pure fructose, which we might get in a fruit, we also don't get pure concentrated fructose very often either. Actually, yes, we might find glucose a little sweeter, a slight difference, but very, very slight. But in that long list of sugars, there are some that have different flavors. And then there's certainly other sweeteners that are used, including non-caloric sweeteners that don't trigger an insulin response. Whether we're talking about so-called artificial sweeteners, aspartame and so forth, or we're talking about monk fruit extract or stevia, those all do have slightly different flavor profiles. So there are variations on the theme of sweet, and some of them come along with a little bit of bitterness or a muted sweetness. But you asked a really good question because, there are only so many flavors we can discern. And then it's almost amazing how we can discern such subtleties of flavor because of the way our brain puts it all together. But, we're talking about just a few categories: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, astringent, umami. I mean, some people argue for more or less, but it's a list about that long. That's it. And everything we taste is a combination of those. So sweet is a category. And what that means is there is neurochemistry involved in our ability to perceive sweet. And it's our ability to perceive sweet. So ultimately, a food is not sweet. Sweetness is in the brain. It's a reaction in our nervous system that we register compounds in a given food in a particular way, and the perception of that is what we call sweetness. It's like seeing colors. It's like everything else about sensory perception. The real action's in the brain. Well, sweet is sweet. It's a category. It's a categorical. If you trigger those particular neurons that register sweet, you detect sweet. It's not as if, there's sweet A, sweet B, sweet C. I haven't heard that. I mean, so everything that's sweet is sweet in much the same way. So by and large, our tongues can't tell the difference. At some level of our metabolism, we can, but it doesn't matter because, it's the total across the board of the kinds of sugars commonly used that leads to an excess. Then they all do all the same harms.
Yeah, which is, as you were explaining that, it really made me think about that health halo effect that you were saying that the marketers would do. Like you said, like now without high fructose corn syrup, or like even the packaging that would say now with cane sugar, right? Like we've taken out these artificial sweeteners,
right?
That's whatever, right. The aspartame, the whatever. So now we're giving you the real thing again. And in 2016, you wrote a piece where you expressed an opinion on artificial sweeteners, and you weren't sure then, whether or not artificial sweeteners were better than sugar. And I'm just wondering, like, if that's changed, and if so or not, why? Like, what should we know? Does consuming these alternative sweeteners also alter the palate and do anything in our body? Like, what do we need to know about that realm of sweetness?
Fantastic questions, and I wish there were a definitive answer. And the reason you bring up that opinion from 2016, it was my informed opinion then, because we didn't have a definitive answer. We still don't. It would be hard to do. I mean, you'd have to randomly assign people to lots of sugar from various sources in their diet, and then a non-caloric artificial sweetener sugar substitute in all the same places, and everything else about the diet would have to be the same. And you'd have to let them eat as much as they want to see what the effects are on caloric intake and appetite and so forth. And you'd have to do this for long enough that you'd see meaningful outcome differences in weight or other things. And it's not undoable. There are some trials people seem to want that I think really can't be done at all. But this one, it could be done, but it's extremely cumbersome, very, very difficult to do. And ideally, people would be blinded to which they're getting, which means you have to kind of mask the food. I mean, everything wrapped in literal masking tapes that can't tell whether it's got the artificial sweetener or the sugar in it. It would be difficult. Hasn't been done. So we have a lot of evidence but it's short-term studies, and it's the administration of an artificial sweetener versus non. And so there are more questions than answers, but these are some of the questions. First, as I was just saying, the reaction in the brain, the neurochemistry to detect sugar in food, is a meter for sweetness, not sugar per se. The reaction in the brain is, this is sweet. It's not, this is sugar. It doesn't identify which of the 257 varieties it is. It just says sweet. And artificial sweeteners trigger that. And, you know, because we know that food has addictive properties and we know sugar is a huge part of that, it stands to reason, well, then sweetness is what makes sugar addictive. It's probably that more than anything else. We don't think driving up insulin levels is addictive. We think a sweet tooth represents the addictive component. In other words, the more sweet you get, the more sweet you want. It just kind of builds on itself. Well, sweet is sweet. So I've long had the concern that people who turn to artificial sweeteners as a way of taking sugar out of their diet are apt to fail because they're still feeding their sweet tooth. And if it was a sweet fang that had taken over their lives, they're not going to file it down by giving it artificial sweeteners. Just as much sweetness, but from a different source. I've worried in particular that because they're feeding that sweet tooth and maybe propagating a craving for lots of sweet, that the sugar they think they're taking out of their diet will sneak in some other door. I mean, I just talked about the fact that there's stealth sugar in everything. So do we know that somebody who drinks diet soda is more inclined to buy the pasta sauce with added sugar in it? We don't know that, but is it logical? It's kind of logical. Would they prefer the breakfast cereal with more sugar? Kind of logical. Would they prefer sweeter desserts, and would they prefer the salad dressing with the added sugar? And if the answers are yes, and we don't know for sure, it's speculative. It was in 2016. These 7 years later, it still is. The work really hasn't been done. Then, frankly, you would be exposed to the potential harms of the artificial sweetener and still get all the sugar. That's been one of my worries. You're not definitively eliminating the problem at the source. You're not preferring a diet that's less sweet, which I think is the ultimate remedy here, that you actually rehabilitate your palate and prefer less sweetness. And that's totally doable, and we need to get into that conversation. But then the other concern that actually has gotten more attention in the intervening 7 years is the direct harms of many artificial sweeteners. So, you know, maybe it's being overblown that there was both an action by the World Health Organization and a reaction to it, with them declaring that aspartame is on the list of potential carcinogens. So, you know, the scientific community said they're overstating the risk, the level of exposure is not enough to cause this kind of harm in people. They're extrapolating from animal studies and so forth. Okay, maybe, but we also have studies showing that artificial sweeteners do seem to disrupt the microbiome. And it doesn't seem to be just one of them. It seems to be a class action to some extent. That's probably not true across the full expanse, but it's interesting that we've seen this with manufactured sugar substitutes, things like aspartame and saccharin, but we've also seen it with sugar alcohols like erythritol. And that was recently in the news, that erythritol was disrupting the microbiome, seemingly increasing risks of insulin resistance. And that was the particularly disconcerting finding. The very thing you would hope to avoid by getting sugar out of your diet and replacing it with just about anything, the anything you were replacing it with was actually contributing to insulin resistance, the risk of diabetes. So where does that land us in 2023, 7 years after I expressed misgivings, which, by the way, I had expressed earlier than that. And I keep hoping, you know, enough definitive research will get done that we'll actually have an empirical answer, a data-based answer. I'm a scientist. I prefer not to conjecture. Whenever we've got the data, I'd like to cite the data. We just don't have them. But we have a lot of alarming findings about artificial sweeteners. We have a lot of doubt about whether they reliably help people reduce their calorie intake. Yes, they do while you're drinking a diet soda versus a regular soda. But what about your overall daily average? Does it just increase your sweet tooth and make you eat more calories later and more sugar and other foods? We don't know. But a lot of studies suggest, yeah, actually, over time, not all that effective for weight loss, not all that effective for managing calories. They may damage the microbiome. They may contribute to insulin resistance. They may contribute to a sweet tooth, and they may or may not help you reduce total sugar. So that's the best you can say about artificial sweeteners is, if you can use them carefully to replace sugar in your diet and not let that sugar sneak in somewhere else, they may offer some advantage because we know how harmful sugar is. And although these compounds, for the most part, don't seem to be terrific, they don't really need to be all that terrific to be better than all the excess sugar you're eating, right? So the lesser of two evils. But I think the very best thing we could say about artificial sweeteners is the lesser of two evils. And maybe not even that, because they may not work all that well to accomplish a reduction in sugar. And then you're exposed to both. And then whatever the harms of the artificial sweetener are compounding the harms of the excess sugar. So I have all kinds of worries I had in 2016 that are still unresolved. The last thing I'll say is we do have new compounds in the mix. I mentioned before monk fruit extract and of course stevia. And these do seem to be advantageous relative to the others. There have been some suggestions these actually help reduce insulin requirements directly and may not disrupt the microbiome. So what we've seen to date pertains to the compounds that have been studied to date. And as we discover new ways to mimic sweetness in safer ways in the diet, we shouldn't necessarily attach original sin to those new compounds. They need to be studied independently. Bottom line is, I'm still not sure.
Fair. So let's talk about solutions, because in much of your writing, you talk about taste bud rehab. You even said palate rehab. What do you mean by that? How do I do it?
Yeah. And so this, whenever I'm asked about artificial sweeteners, I say, it should be moot. Yeah, we'd like to know and we need the science. But honestly, these are chemical compounds that are not really food that we're putting into food. And if we ate and drank real food, who needs them? So, I use myself as sort of a poster child. There are no artificial sweeteners in my diet because there's very little added sugar in my diet. But when I want something sweet, my wife's making dessert, her vegan chocolate mousse, which, by the way, it's on the Cuisinisty site. It's so great. Vegan and amazing and minimal added sugar. And in fact, I guess really none. It comes from dates. So no overtly added sugar, but it's sweet. It's a dessert. But when I want something sweet, I don't mind that it be an actual source of sugar from a fruit or a little bit of added sugar in a dessert. But it's a tiny, tiny part of my overall diet. And that's because when I'm thirsty, I drink water. And if you want something a little snazzier than water, knock yourself out. I mean, you could have a seltzer with a fruit essence. I mean, there are all sorts of ways to tantalize your mouth and taste buds with something that has no added sugar and no artificial sweetener either. So do that. And, just by focusing on soda, we could eliminate a massive amount of sugar and calories from our diets and avoid those chemicals. And, oh, by the way, save a ton of money too, because water, we all complain about the cost of food, but it's amazing how many people who complain about the cost of food and shopping and diet drink soda every day. And it's both expensive to buy and expensive down the road because, bad for your teeth, bad for your pancreas, bad for your heart. Those are going to be costs you're going to pay at some point too. So anyway, just get rid of that stuff. And what I really like is the process we were talking about before. So if you have a sweet tooth, you can't just suddenly say, I'm going to deny it, because it's going to fight with you. Some people can do that. You can cold turkey approach to changing your diet. Most people don't do terribly well with that. But we can all do taste bud rehab. Taste buds are adaptable little fellas. When they can't be with the foods they love, they readily learn to love the foods they're with. And the most vivid illustration of how adaptable they are is culture. This ethnic diet. So, it's not a coincidence that Japanese babies grow up liking raw fish and Mexican babies grow up liking chilies and Indian babies grow up liking curry. They're exposed to it in your utero. They're exposed to it via breast milk, and it's part of their culture. It's familiar. The single most potent driver of taste preference is familiarity. So if you're familiar with ultra-processed junk food laden with copious amounts of sugar, you're going to sadly prefer that. You actually like the taste of junk where food ought to be. And a lot of Americans are in that sad situation because that's what our food supply has done to us, corrupted our palates, made us crave ridiculous amounts of not just sugar, but added salt and food chemicals and artificial flavorings and so forth. You can reverse engineer that process one item at a time. You can pick your, the cereal aisle. You can pick the bread aisle. You pick the salty snack aisle. You can pick the sweets. You can pick the dairy. start where you want, start everywhere at once, but just slowly start to move in the direction of choices where the first ingredient is the right ingredient. So never have a breakfast cereal for yourself or your kid where the first ingredient is a sugar or a combination of sugars. I mean, that's not cereal with sugar, that's sugar with cereal. And sometimes the cereal that's added is a bit dubious because it's not even a whole grain. So, you pick a better one. Pick the pasta sauce without the added sugar. Pick the salad dressing. What I've done with my patients over 30 years is I've started, whenever they say, I've really got a sweet tooth, that's my liability. Help me, doc. It's okay. And help me, but don't take away my dessert. And don't take away my soda. Okay. All right. So, between a rock and a hard place, help me. So, all right, I can do that. What we're going to do is we're first going to take sugar out of all the places where you didn't know was hiding. So what we were talking about before, stealth sugar, look at ingredient lists, pick everything with a shorter ingredient list, get rid of all that sugar in places it doesn't belong. And you'd be amazed how many grams of daily sugar you've just eliminated. And then step two, your taste buds, after a couple of weeks of that, and we're talking about just a couple of weeks, will be more sensitive. Everything else where you expected sugar to be is starting to taste a little sweeter. So, okay, let's start to dial that down. You can tell me which food you want to start with. We can do it all at once. But what we're going to do now is we're going to look for alternatives. So and back to the conversation about artificial sweeteners. It's not outrageous that maybe you would transition from soda to diet soda to seltzer, and then maybe to water, or maybe stick with the seltzer. But I think we should use all the tools at our disposal. So I don't like artificial sweeteners as a long-term game plan, but as a transitional element, I think they're potentially helpful. We can get rid of the sugar, get rid of the calories. As long as we're careful about the rest of your diet at the same time, we know the sugar is not going to sneak back in, and then we can use this as a stepping stone. And I think that can work. In much the same way, if we were having a conversation about meat today instead of sugar, we could talk about plant-based meats. Are they a panacea? No. Would it be better to actually eat, beans and lentils? Yeah, but maybe they're a gateway. And so, if you're eating meat now, you eat less meat, you eat those, and then you slowly acquire a taste for more plants and you transition to eating more plants. So the same thing with the sugar. And I think artificial sweeteners potentially can play that role. And then you need to learn a little bit about cooking, because some of this is going to involve what you do yourself at home. And here too, I think you need help from someone who's gone before you. I offer up my wife, who's done such a brilliant job. One of the things she's focused on at Cuisinicity is reinventing everything that has added sugar so that it has much, much less. So when we're talking about sweets, how much sugar do you really need to add to have a dessert be fully satisfying? And she's figured out the minimum. And of course, that minimum varies depending on where your palate is set. So if you're drinking soda all day long and eating stuff with added sugar all day long, you'd probably eat a dessert that I would love and you would find it not sweet enough. Whereas if I take a bite out of what most Americans are eating, I have to spit it out. This actually happened, by the way. I was at an airport one time, and I was in between flights and on an extended trip, and my snack pack had run dry and I was hungry. And a smoothie bar looked like the most promising option. And, obviously the big letters were all about the fruit and all the good stuff. So I said, okay, I'll have that. And I want strawberry and blueberry and banana. But, little did I realize that there's a base concoction in there. I took one sip of this and I just looked for a trash bin, to get rid of it. I dumped it and I spit it out. I cannot stomach this. Sickeningly sweet. And yet there was a long line there. It was the healthy option. I mean, we're that far gone that the healthy option was just ridiculously sweet. I couldn't even eat it. But there's nothing special about me. My taste buds are not unique. It's just, I've acclimated to a diet of real food, mostly plants. And so a little bit of sweetness goes a long way for me. This is a long-term game plan. You actually prefer less sweet. You don't like very sweet food. You don't care if it's actual sugar or artificial sweetener. Either way, if it's extremely sweet, you don't want it. You don't like it. And the goal here respects the fact that you should get pleasure from food. That's important. And, when you talk about sugar, I mean, all these conversations, we have to be careful not to moralize, right? I mean, eating well is not a moral imperative. This is not you should because someone tells you. This is you should because your life will be better. Healthy people have more fun. And that's really what's going on here. And so if the whole goal is to have a better life, well, gee, I don't know. I'm robbing Peter to pay Paul here, right? I mean, I'm giving up the pleasure from food I love to have health that I can love more. No, love the food that loves you back. That's the goal. That's the tagline of Cuisinicity. That's what my wife and I, I in theory, she in practice is the cook. That's what we've talked about our whole lives, and we've raised 5 kids this way. Love the food that loves you back. Yes, it involves if your diet has been toxified by living in America, you have to detoxify it, go through taste bud rehab. But the place you land is a place where you actually really love more wholesome food, and you start to reject the junk that prevails as food. We have research evidences. I have evidence from many of my patients, but we have studies that show you take people who have preferences for highly processed junk food, and you take them through the process of taste bud rehab. In as little as about 3 months, they go from craving junk and having aversions to, for example, fresh vegetables, to the opposite, the absolute converse, craving food direct from nature and having aversions to the ultra processed junk. And so that's the goal, where a little bit of sweetness goes a long way. You don't eliminate pleasure. You don't eliminate good food from your life. You combine good food with good health, and you sort of redefine good food as food that's pleasurable in the moment, but pleasurable over time too, because it's really nourishing your body.
So thinking about that and what you had talked about earlier about, there's kind of almost like this override once we hit like what's for dessert? Like all of a sudden I have this empty leg kind of thing. You had talked about controlling your hunger by limiting flavor variety at one sitting, and then the satiety centers of our brain will make us feel fuller faster. Can you kind of talk about like how does that tie into the sweet and what you were just talking about with the taste bud rehab?
This is work mostly by Barbara Rolls at Penn State University, and to the best of my knowledge, she was among the first to put sensory-specific satiety into the literature. So yeah, earlier we were talking about hollow leg, extra stomach. They don't exist. We do anatomy in medical school. We went looking for those. We could not find them. But the answer is known, and it is in the appetite center. It's sensory-specific satiety, and it's the reason why at the end of a big holiday meal, when you really are too full to have another bite of turkey or whatever you're eating, you can still eat dessert because you're actually shifting to a different meter, if you will, essentially a different registry in the appetite center. Okay, I'm full of salty, I'm full of savory, I'm full of umami, I'm not full of sweet. And by the way, the threshold for sweet is higher than any of the others. So it takes more to turn that one off than any of the others. And by the way, none of this is coincidental. This is evolutionary biology. The one taste preference all humans are born with is sweet. And that's advantageous because human breast milk is slightly sweet because of the lactose in it. So if baby mammals did not prefer something slightly sweet to something not, if they rejected their mother's breast milk, well, baby mammals who don't drink their mother's breast milk do not do very well and grow up to be big mammals. And babies that don't grow up to be grown-ups don't have babies of their own and make very poor ancestors and don't pass along their genes. So we're all here with the genes that favored survival, and one of those was a preference for sweet. So we're actually born with that taste preference. And then, we have to spend the rest of our lives managing it. But we certainly can dial down that preference. And it's not terribly difficult to do. As I said, you really can completely adjust what you crave and what you have aversions to. It happens pretty quickly. But all of these elements are essentially native vulnerabilities that are built into us by adaptation. If we lived in a world where food came direct from nature, the sources of sugar would be wild fruits and honey that we would have to wrestle from bees. We think about the Paleolithic diet, that's where sugar came from, and no place else. There was no added sugar in anything. It was either honey or fruit. And all of that was good for us. And then the one other source was breast milk during the first year or so of life, also good for us, right? So it makes sense to have that craving. So it is built into us. But it's very clear that we can dial it down. We can become much more sensitive to sugar, prefer much less. And then you get the same level of satisfaction with considerably smaller doses.
Amazing. So I know we're running out of time, but I really wanted the opportunity to talk to you a bit about um, almost like that public health consideration that you have, as far as, again, when we're talking about solutions, folks can learn to read labels, maybe spend some time online, maybe even like on an app, where I know like you can kind of do your grocery shopping online these days. If you don't have time to stand in the grocery store looking at your labels, get on the apps, look at these labels, make decisions based on what aligns with your goals, what you need to do, taste bud or palate rehab, thinking about just getting rid of some of that added sugar, dial down that sweetness. Maybe you'll find that you're fuller faster by focusing more on umami or salt or something along those lines. But I also know that you wrote things about, taking back what delicious means, and how the way that humans are meant to eat is not an obscure idea, but that it's been obscured, and that there are some of these like fundamental truths that maybe have been hidden or overridden by some of these louder voices out there. So what can we do on, like, from a grassroots level position when we think about this bigger public health policy need?
Yeah. So, and before I go there, I just realized that in my prior answer, I didn't quite loop back to where you started with sensory specific satiety. So just to finish that up. So my biggest concern actually is that, as we talked about the extraordinary science of addictive junk food by Michael Moss, the variety engineered into individual foods makes us overeat them. That's why sugar is in foods that aren't particularly sweet. Salt is in foods that aren't particularly salty. A lot of breakfast cereals have more salt per calories than anything in the salty snack aisle. So I think that, the single best way to avoid the excess, the cacophony of conflicting flavors that overstimulates the appetite center, is to simplify individual foods. And then there's some advantage also to avoiding a sequence of flavor exposures every time you eat, right? You don't need to have dessert after lunch. And frankly, you don't need to have dessert after every dinner. I mean, decide. Dessert's an indulgence. And sure, it's a pleasure. And on occasions we want to have it. But know that even if you've eaten enough, you're still going to have room for dessert. So be careful, manage that, right? And you certainly don't want to be exposing your palate to a maximal variety of flavors. You want to avoid an all-you-can-eat buffet. Everybody overeats an all-you-can-eat buffet. It may seem like a bargain, but basically the reality of an all-you-can-eat buffet is you're going to overeat and get fat at no extra charge, and then probably spend a fortune to lose the weight rather that you gain for free. So, avoid those. So, essentially America is an all-you-can-eat buffet. We're overstimulated. The appetite center is overstimulated. Added sugar is a big part of that. So simplifying your eating occasions so that you don't have lots of flavors clashing all the time and overstimulate your appetite center is advantageous. Then, I think that is a part of the big picture. A lot of the fundamental truths about diet, Molly, really, have to do with simplicity. So when Mark Bittman and I wrote How to Eat, we were thinking, we really shouldn't need to write another book on it. And it's so simple. Michael Pollan said it in 7 words: eat food, not too much, mostly plants. That's right. And you can unpack that. So by food, he means real food. So shorter the ingredient list, the better. Direct from nature, the best of all. Plants, what do we mean? Vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds. Lots of those in a minimally processed or unprocessed state. Less of everything else. And again, this is not proselytizing. I'm not saying none. You want some dairy, have some dairy. You want some meat, have some meat. Make good choices there too. Obviously, the cleaner, the better. But if your diet emphasizes those things, you can't go too far wrong. And this is not, again, a moral imperative. Although you could argue, Molly, and if you don't mind, at the close here, I don't mind saying this. There is a moral element to our dietary choices. It's just not about our own health. I don't think any one of us can wag a finger and tell another of us, you need to be healthy. What we do with our own bodies, our own health is an individual choice. But how we affect one another's health by means of affecting planetary health, how we affect climate change and greenhouse gas emissions and water utilization, how we affect whether or not some thirsty person somewhere in the world has potable water to drink. That matters. That's an ethical imperative for all. I think how our dietary choices affect how we treat our fellow creatures, and the cruelties of factory farming also. There are moral imperatives. I look at diet, by the way, through 3 lenses. What does it do directly to human health? How does it cause us to treat our fellow creatures? and what is it doing to the health of the planet? I care about all three, and I think we all should. The fortuitous fact is that the simple imperatives of diet are good for all three. If we eat food, not too much, mostly plants, better for us, better for our fellow creatures, and better for the planet, and that's pretty much incontrovertible. So that's what we need to get right, and it really does go a very long way to solving the sugar problem. I don't drink soda and I don't like it. It's way too sweet. It's sickly sweet. And again, I'm not special. It's just that I practice what I preach. So these things that I talk about doing, I've done first. I put myself through taste bud rehab when I was a teenager, and I haven't had soda in 40 years or something. But when I taste it, I hate it. It's crazy sweet. And artificial sweeteners don't improve the equation at all. So I don't want it. There's no deprivation not drinking that. And sometimes I really do enjoy, I mostly drink water when I'm thirsty, but I really do enjoy some of those seltzers, which are fizzy and have a natural fruit essence as a flavor. So, lemon or a berry, they're really quite nice. Lime, particularly like lime. So, there are places to go when you want a little bit of palate entertainment. But I just prefer those. I just don't like. So similarly, I don't like ultra processed food. It tastes like junk to me. And I'm not special. I've just gone down this path. You can too. So the emphasis should be on a balanced assembly of wholesome foods most of the time. And then that not only offers a massive advantage to your overall health vitality, but it also offers a massive advantage to your palate, because it becomes the gravitational force that actually directs your whole orientation to food. You actually prefer that kind of food. And it gets easier and easier and easier to choose wholesome foods the more wholesome foods you eat, because that becomes the familiar. That becomes the preference. So, on an individual side, that's what I favor. There are a lot of things that I favor on the policy side, on the supply side, and I've been working at that my whole career. I do think, although you can use anyone on a number of apps to try and learn the details of which choice you might make in the supermarket. And I worked on a project of that sort for years. It was called NuVal, 1 to 100. The higher the number, the more nutritious the food. At one point, we were in 2,000 supermarkets on the shelf tag in front of every item. I like that. It was, that's why I devoted years of effort to that. But the food industry, if you have a really good front of pack system, the food industry is pretty good at killing it. They don't want a really good one, because simple fact is so much of our food supply is junk. Anything that tells the truth, we'll call that out. So on our 1 to 100 scale, there were a lot of ones, and they were terrible. And basically our algorithm, the overall nutritional quality index algorithm, the NuVal system, told the truth. The industry didn't like that too much. But you don't need to be that sophisticated. We actually did some studies where we compared the results of using the Nutrition Detectives program, which is 5 clues that fit on a refrigerator magnet that you can teach an 8-year-old, to a sophisticated algorithm like the Anki and NuVal. And it was very, very comparable. So the shorter the ingredient list, the better. Avoid ingredients you don't recognize and can't pronounce. Make sure the first ingredient is appropriate. If it's a grain product, make sure it's a whole grain and ideally has at least 2 grams of fiber per 100 calories. And simple things like that, just a very short set. So you can Google Nutrition Detectives. All that material is available for free. It's in thousands of schools all around the world. But I don't think you need to make this rocket science. You can keep it pretty simple, high-level concepts, focus on the overall quality of the diet. And if you get your dietary pattern right, you solve the sugar problem. You also solve a host of other problems, because although sugar is a major liability of the modern American diet, it isn't the only one.
Agreed. I think that's one of the things that I appreciate so much about your writing, is that it is about keeping it simple. It's about not demonizing one thing over another. It's very in the gray, which is where I prefer to be. It's like an uncomfortable place for a lot of people. And I think it also pushes a lot of buttons in those like camps that get very dichotomous. And I kind of love that too. It's the rebel in me, which I imagine there's a bit of a rebel in you. So before I let you go, and I know I'm going to let you go, I'm really curious to know what's next for you. Like another book? Is there another program? What's next?
So I pivoted from academic medicine, where I spent most of my career. I was at Yale most of my career, and at Griffin Hospital. I took care of patients for 30 years. I ran a lab. I became an entrepreneur very much by accident. I invented a new way to assess diet. So we can do a comprehensive assessment of dietary intake, inclusive of sugar, total sugar, added sugar, but everything else, 200 nutrients, all the different kinds of foods, an objective measure of your overall diet quality. We can do that in 60 seconds, and it's fun. So anybody who's ever been through the ardors of a food frequency questionnaire or a multi-day journal or food recall knows they are not fun. They are the furthest thing from fun. Diet ID is fun. It's image based. It's, which of these looks more like how you eat, A or B, A or B, A or B. We've got you in 60 seconds. So I founded a company. I've been running it for 7.5 years. We are a B2B company, so we market to health systems, wellness programs, and our mission is to make diet quality a vital sign. We took that innovation and built it out so that we use the same approach, the image-based approach, to help you identify a personalized goal diet. And then down to a very quantitative level, including grams of sugar, we compare where you are to where you want to be and show the exact difference. And then we turn that into a sequence of incremental changes, what we've been talking about, taste bud rehab, palate reform. But it's kind of analogous to a GPS turn list, right? I mean, GPS knows where you are. You tell it where you want to go. It creates a sequence of turns that will get you there. So at Diet ID, we do that for dietary change. What I'm really excited about is we can make diet quality a vital sign. Everybody who knows their blood pressure should know their diet quality. One thing to leave this audience with, and again, sugar is an important part of this, but it's not the only part. Diet quality, overall diet quality measured objectively, is the single leading predictor variable for premature death and chronic disease in the United States today, full stops. Number one, the leading reason people die prematurely is bad overall diet quality. Well, how can we sanction not knowing people's diet quality? It'd be like saying, well, we know blood pressure is really important to heart attacks, strokes, etc., but we don't measure blood pressure in the body. We just hope it's okay. That's crazy. So it's a new day. So we're working to make diet quality a vital sign. We then, of course, when everybody knows their diet quality and puts it in front of health professionals, it becomes a cue to action. We think that will motivate the reform we need in education so that docs are obligated to learn much more about nutrition. We can't neglect it. People didn't know much about managing blood pressure until the blood pressure cuff was invented. But once everybody had their blood pressure measured all the time, and many of those numbers were not good, people started asking, well, what do we do when the numbers aren't good? And whole new fields opened up. We want that to be now for diet quality. So that's really the next best big thing for me, doing everything I can to make diet quality a vital sign. We think Diet ID is to diet with the blood pressure cuff was to blood pressure. And my goal is to hang in there long enough to see that day dawn where everybody's got diet quality in their electronic health record. And it's a cue to action, and we take it seriously, and food really is medicine, and we turn this all around.
Amazing. Well, thank you again so much, Dr. Katz. I appreciate your time. I apologize for running you over. I hope that you have a great rest of your day.
It's been a pleasure, Molly. Thank you very much. Same to you.
Thanks. Take care.
I hope you enjoyed this interview, and before you go, do one more thing. Stop, think back on the interview while it's fresh in your mind, and write down your favorite takeaway in a special dedicated journal. If you do this, at the end of the summit, you'll have a page or two of nuggets of wisdom to guide you forward. And remember, this is just the beginning. At the end of the summit, you'll be invited to attend a free webinar where I will personally summarize the key insights of our speakers and pull it all together into a practical plan of action. You can also check out our Facebook page where you can connect with others and ask questions, and our Kick Sugar Coach podcast and YouTube channel for additional inspiration. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you in the next interview.